the Russians are coming back. The Russians want to reestablish empire, and part of that is swallowing up the Baltics again.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. And I'm rejoined by my partner in all things strategery and jackassery, Eliot Cohen, who is professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Welcome back, world traveler.
Well, it's good to be back. I'm still a little bit jet lagged, but I'm up for the fight. And my understanding, Eric, is that in my absence, you unaccountably neglected to mention the jackassery of the week, and I think our devoted listeners deserve more of us. So I think we should actually go through a whole set of jackasseries before we launch into my trip report. Do you want to start?
I'm happy to start. It's a target-rich environment, and I suspect both of us have similar, list of idiocies that have occurred. I'll start with one, which is we did a special show on the meltdown that the president had with Zelensky in the Oval Office a couple of months ago. He engaged in some real jackassery, last week with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who he ambushed, with a discussion of the supposed white genocide that's going on in South Africa, with photos that were taken of a protest, although he didn't acknowledge that, and video that was shot in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Other than that, the video montage that he put on for the president to document this alleged white genocide was perfectly fine.
You really do wonder what idiot in the White House did that. I mean, did they do it and think that they wouldn't be caught? Did they just pick it off of, I don't know, TikTok or YouTube or something like that? I mean, it's, I mean, when we talk about jackassery, some of this is to make fun of these people, but some of it is, you're just stunned by the kind of stupidity and above all the incompetence. I mean, that is really pretty gross incompetence.
I don't want to take words out of your mouth or gainsay where you're going next, but I would note that the White House posted the video because they've stopped posting transcripts of the president's speeches.
Yes.
The video of his speech to the graduating class at the Army Academy.
Yes, which used to be known as the U.S. Military Academy, but
right.
That's gone out the window with the Gulf of Mexico. Actually, speaking of that, so my candidate for the jackassery of the week was that speech in which he began talking to the cadets about trophy wives. Now, that's a rather unusual thing to begin speaking to prospective second lieutenants about, wouldn't you say?
And to compound it and add insult to injury, in addition to the meandering speech that he made, he also said he was going to give them some life skill advice, which he'd given at a previous commencement address at Ohio State. Only problem was it actually was at the University of Alabama.
People confuse Alabama and Ohio all the time. I mean, just read, Hillbilly Elegy, and you can get it. This is a serious issue, which is, I'm pretty well convinced that I'm not a doctor, so I can do this without fear of losing my license, that he's showing signs of dementia. And dementia doesn't get any better, as we both know. And, you really, and there's more and more behavior of this, which is just like insanely erratic. So, he's giving a Memorial Day speech, and all of a sudden, he's tweeting about the scum capitalized in who are running the country for the last 4 years. And you just have a sense that things are slipping there. And you do wonder, this is just the first 4 months. And, some people might say, well, he's always been this way, and in which case you've got a different problem. But I also, there's a part of me that says this is getting worse, and this is some sort of trajectory, and it cannot end well. Any thoughts on that one?
No, I quite agree. I mean, again, on the military academy speech, he told the graduates, normally the president or vice president, because they rotate around who gives the commencement address, would stay and shake hands with the graduates, and but he didn't do that. He didn't have time because he said he's busy dealing with China and Russia, and flew off from West Point to Bedminster where he played golf. I mean, which is just kind of classless, and what can you say? I mean, look, they're more serious jackassery afoot. The NSC staff, which has already been rocked by the departure of Mike Waltz and a bunch of other staffers, was disemboweled this week in a, quote, reorganization orchestrated, as I understand it, by Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, in which Alex Wong, who had been the deputy national security advisor and been presiding over what passed for a process, which now I think is going to be completely non-existent in the administration, and who was a fellow that you and I both know, pretty smart, pretty capable. He was sort of dismissed on half hour's notice, as were the senior directors for Europe, the Middle East, Iran. There are a few others who are hanging on by a thread, who I won't name for fear of damaging them.
So actually, I had not heard about Alex Wong, so he just fired.
Fired along with Eric Traeger and Merev Seren and Andrew Peake, all given their walking papers on a half hour's notice. Now, some of these people are kind of MAGA people.
Yeah. Some of them are actually like halfway reasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, and Alex, you and I both know Andrew. I know Andrew Peake as well.
As do I.
And I can now reveal that once upon a time he got a PhD with me. But I mean, I guess I gather the other thing. I did see one thing where Rubio was saying, well, we believe the NSC staff here is basically here to execute the president's orders, and so they're gonna take it down to, I think, like 50 people or something like that, which is roughly the size it was under McGeorge Bundy, when actually it had fewer responsibilities and covered fewer areas. And I think on the one hand, there is certainly a case to be made that under Obama and Biden, it got way too big.
I agree.
500, 600 people.
Yeah, I agree.
That's not what it's supposed to be. But to take it down to a tenth that size is dangerous because, and we can talk about this when I do my trip report. A lot of the time, I find myself trying to explain to people how the American government works, and I say, when people talk about who the national security advisor is, well, yeah, on the one hand, they are giving national security advice, but that's actually the least important part of their job. The most important part of their job is managing a deliberate policy process where issues get assessed at different levels, and you have this kind of nested set of committees. And of course, you and I spent a lot of time in the deputies committee, right before you go to the principals, the cabinet members, then ultimately when the president charges it, the NSC. So I think your point is it's a really important one that we should emphasize for our listeners. They're creating a system that will have no process, and that is a recipe for disaster. I mean, a good process does not guarantee you good policy, but a bad process makes it, or the absence of process, which I think is what you really have in a kind of a command system with the president surrounded by kooks and sycophants. It really, it's going to lead to something bad.
I feel it in my bones. I agree with you totally. I mean, Marco Rubio is now the national security advisor and the secretary of state, and also the chief archivist of the United States and the director of whatever is left of USAID, which isn't much. But the truth is he's going to not be running the process, and there's no Brent Scowcroft to run the process when Henry Kissinger had both jobs, and Brent was the deputy who was in effect really the national security advisor, and ultimately became the national security advisor when there were enough objections to the way it was running, with Kissinger doing both jobs. And the fact that Andy Baker, who works for um, Vice President Vance, has been named Deputy National Security Advisor and presumably will now be running the show there, whatever it is, I think is, none of this is, augurs well.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other, kind of a jackassery I would point to before we get to your trip report, which I'm really dying to hear. The Washington Post reported today, who would have guessed it? Infighting continues in the office of the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. And, this should not come as a surprise given the multiple firings and rearranging of deck chairs, on the, good ship Lollipop that is being run over there. Apparently, despite the departure of all these, Cato, responsible statecraft Quincy Institute types who had been inserted into the department with Secretary Hegseth, infighting in his own staff continues. And it's a very dysfunctional department from everything I can gather. A woman who's trafficked in all sorts of, Russian propaganda, anti-Ukrainian stuff, and anti-Semitic tropes has been named to be the press secretary. It just seems, like, continuing dysfunction, and everything I've heard suggests that the Secretary of Defense is capable of delivering talking points when he meets with, foreign interlocutors, but can't get beyond that.
Yeah. And,
because he's not deep in any of the issues.
I think it's always striking who you surround yourself with. And, his two top advisors, who are apparently, according to the story, at daggers drawn, one's a Marine colonel, okay. The other's a sergeant major. And with all due respect to senior non-commissioned officers, there's very little usually that prepares somebody who's had those kinds of jobs, which are very hands-on, working with troops. They're absolutely critical, and a lot of those people are very, very smart indeed. But that's not how it's not what prepares you for a policy job. It's a different line of work. The main thing that struck me about that, though, is these guys are clearly leaking to the Post about each other. And it just tells you that is a poisonous atmosphere. And my guess is, that the White House will wait a little while and then they'll get rid of Hegseth. They just don't want it to look like, people like you and me and Jeff Goldberg did him in.
Right. They don't want it's the no scalps policy that Trump has articulated.
But it's clearly very, very bad. And, my guess is that, I thought the other thing that was interesting is that the two guys who were mentioned, both on the verge of resignation, in part because, one thing that a sergeant major or a Marine colonel are likely to have is a desire for some form of organization and, something orderly. And that's clearly not what's going on. So that's...
There's also another dimension to this, which is the continued perversion of incentives inside the building for uniformed military. The firings we've talked about of General C.Q. Brown and Admiral Lisa Franchetti and others who've been relieved, General Hawk at NSA, fine officers being removed for no cause whatsoever. And then you have his current chief of staff, who, as you say, was a Marine lieutenant colonel, I believe, who essentially retired or took early retirement in order to take on a civilian political role. And this just reeks of like all the wrong incentives being created from a civil military point of view. We probably should get our friend and frequent guest on Shield of the Republic, Peter Fever, on at some point to talk about this in more depth. But it's just, again, I just think it's not conducive to a healthy, defense establishment, and I worry about where it's headed. And you worry if Hegseth leaves, by the way, about who becomes Secretary of Defense. I mean, I hate to even say it because I don't want to, I won't say it because I don't want to say anything that would actually get in the way of what I would hope would be the outcome there. So I'll, whereof, as Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, one should be silent.
Well, okay, now that we've quoted Wittgenstein, we can move on to other things. So I just came back from this trip, and I thought we could use it as a way to talk about a number of things. First, I want to say this. So this is a trip that took me to Edinburgh, London, Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, Stockholm, Sweden, and Warsaw, Poland, giving a bunch of lectures, going to some conferences, and then just getting a lot of very good one-on-one time, including with a lot of very, very senior people, and particularly in all of those places, senior policy people, chiefs of defense staff, policy directors and ministries of defense, intelligence chiefs and stuff. So it was fascinating. First thing I want to say, by the way, is it turns out there are a lot of Shield of the Republic listeners abroad, and we were really delighted to have you. And I have to say, just how what a thrill it was to hear from you saying, "Hey, listen, I listened to Shield of the Republic." The overall comment that I want to make, and then I'll just run quickly through these countries, and then you decide where we take it. On the one hand, having taught in war colleges, I know that we try to convey the idea that strategy is a deliberate, rational process of matching military means and political ends. In practice, and that's desirable in a way, but in practice, actually, it's about wrestling with ghosts. And that's really it's the theme of an article that I'm going to write about this. So let me just walk quickly through it. So in the UK, one of the things I did was to talk to a number of people about this impending strategy and defense review. And, I went to a lot of nice places, had tea in the House of Lords. And, you see the ghosts of empire all around you. I mean, they're physically present as, you look at the portraits on the wall, the coats of arms, the references. The problem in the British case is this has meant that it claims more of a role than it can actually sustain. Now, the Brits have done a lot of wonderful things, and some of these ghosts were productive. Boris Johnson, I think, was invoking the ghost of Winston Churchill when he immediately dashed off to Ukraine after the invasion, and the Brits led us in doing things like getting the Ukrainians tanks. They've been very forward-leading in terms of having people on the ground, which we have not.
Longer range fires also.
Longer range fires, really helping the Ukrainian defense industry. But the problem is that the kind of muscle underneath all this, and the British have terrific niche capabilities. Their special forces are great. Their signals intelligence community is very good, and MI6, their human intelligence service, is very good. But as this strategy and defense review is going to make clear, that they cannot fund what they're doing unless they begin to tear apart some parts of the welfare state. And it's very unlikely that a Labour government will do this. So on the one hand, they have to completely recapitalize their nuclear force. They've got 4 submarines. The last submarine was out on patrol for something like 285 days underwater. You cannot keep people going. They've bought these 2 god-awful aircraft carriers, which are really big, 65,000 tons. But first,
No aircraft to fly off of them.
They didn't have the aircraft to fly off them. There were manufacturing faults with the propeller shafts. And above all, these giant aircraft carriers, which are gigantic targets, which are fine for showing the flag of the Pacific, it's not clear how useful they are in Europe or the Mediterranean. And these things are eating the Navy. So the Navy is now down to 14 surface ships. During the Falklands War, it was over 50 surface combatants, plus some small carriers.
Rule Britannia.
Rule Britannia. The British Army, again, qualitatively, they're fantastic. However, there are only 76,000 of them. And, when they, for example, talked about, well, we'll deploy a brigade, I think Keir Starmer, the prime minister, said, we'll deploy a brigade in this peace enforcement, peacekeeping, reinsurance force. They can't deploy a brigade, because if you deploy a brigade somewhere, you've got to have like 3 brigades back that are in some sort of what they call roulement, rotation status. And, British officers have been saying, we can't do that. They just don't have the manpower. So they're stuck. And they're stuck in part, I think, because of, first, some very bad choices. But it's, the ghosts of empire, in a way, have misled them.
Can I make a comment, if I might? Because you and I spent a lot of time with our UK colleagues back in the Bush 43 administration, traveling to London together to consult with them on a whole host of things. And like you, I have a lot of admiration for them. I also think, and as much as I admire Tony Blair, and I do, our UK colleagues are paying the wages of the Blair-Brown rivalry, in the sense that Blair had an enormous appetite for deploying British military force in the 90s, and through his departure in 2010 as prime minister. And it was not 2010. I'm sorry, it was earlier. It was back in 2007. But he did not have a chancellor, Gordon Brown, who was willing to fund the defense establishment. And so lots of deployment, lots of wear and tear, and not enough investment. Is that fair?
Oh, I think it's very fair. But part of this is there's a broader self-conception of Britain as a global power. And we did not help entirely with this, in particular by urging them to get involved in the Pacific. I mean, we need them right now to be a European power. I'm not sure how much they're really going to add to us in the Pacific. We need them opposite Russia. So from there, I went to a lot of other interesting, being there on VE Day, and with the kind of cultural aspects of that. I went to Tallinn, Estonia, for the Lennert Meri Conference, which is a annual kind of defense, security, foreign policy conference, really oriented, obviously, around Russia. And there were 3 things that struck me. One, some good news. The U.S. ambassador to NATO gave a not particularly dazzling, but perfectly normal speech about NATO and about the American commitment to NATO, in which, of course, we need you guys to do more, but we are a part of the alliance and so on. That was, I think people found that reassuring. And in general, I would say most of my European interlocutors sort of assumed that, yeah, Trump is trouble, but, this thing will not completely fall apart. So that's one thing. Second thing, the Estonians very worried about Russian hybrid gray zone operations. One of the things that happened while just before I think I arrived, the Russians have this fleet of like 500, 600 oil tankers, which are either flagged to countries like Gabon or have no flags at all.
This is the so-called ghost fleet.
The ghost fleet. These are a menace in a variety of ways. It's what allows them to export lots and lots of oil. And so the Estonians stopped one, which I think was Gabon. And in Estonian waters, as they're kind of getting ready to board it, they get buzzed by a Russian Su-35. So this is actually intruding into NATO airspace. It had to spend about a minute in Estonian airspace, which is NATO airspace, and some Portuguese jets, I guess, scrambled to intercept. But there's a whole set of things that are going on in the Baltic, to include ships dragging anchors and tearing up cables and stuff like that. And as somebody recently pointed out, the Baltic is not yet really a NATO lake. I mean, we haven't kind of orchestrated the sort of naval forces that we need for that. The third thing, and this again gets to the ghosts, the Estonians, of course, suffered terribly under the Russians. There was mass deportations. I think Kaja Kallas, her family was deported. It is a thriving little country. I mean, it's quite small, like about, I think, 1.3 million people. It is a digital nation. And they resent being kind of lectured to particularly by the West Europeans, about Russia, which they feel they know a lot better than we do. So their ghosts are the ghosts of occupation, and they are particularly worried, about the prospect of, that by the belief. I mean, they are convinced of this. The Russians are coming back. The Russians want to reestablish empire, and part of that is swallowing up the Baltics again. And I think that's a view that's shared in the other Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia.
Can I interject?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Two things. One, as you say, first of all, this is not new view of theirs. This is something they've believed for a while. And I can recall Lennert Meri himself, when he was a foreign minister of newly independent Estonia, making the case very passionately for Baltic membership in NATO in the first tranche in 96, 97, and complaining bitterly that that we owed them for having allowed the Baltic states to be swallowed up in 1940 by the Soviet Union. So that's again, that's as you say, this is there's living memory here. It's not just a ghost. I mean,
yeah.
The other thing, of course, is we've seen I'm sure you saw the reports while you were gone about Russia redeploying forces, into the north, along what is now the sort of northeast quadrant of NATO, not just the Balts, but also
opposite Finland,
the Nordics, the Finns, and of course, as a former ambassador to Finland, I follow that pretty closely. So, this is not just people's imagination,
no.
And no. I think people are lulled because of Russia's poor performance in Ukraine. People are lulled into the notion that, they would never try this, against NATO, without reckoning with the fact that, the time-space dimension in the Baltics is totally different than trying to fight a war with an undermanned force across 1,000-kilometer front, as they have in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, these are very small countries. Now, mind you, they are prepared to fight, but they need help. No, one of the topics of discussion at gatherings like this is how long does it take the Russians to reconstitute? Some people say 3 years, some people say 5 years. One of the arguments you hear is what Vladimir Putin does not want to do is to bring a whole bunch of PTSD, angry veterans back to the streets of Russian cities. So the logical thing is give them a new front. And I think there is an argument to be made that what you're seeing created in Russia is a permanent warfare state, where the logic of war is just sort of self-perpetuating, particularly from an internal political view. And I think there's a lot to that. From Tallinn, I went to Sweden, and I've found fascinating. Stockholm, lovely city, as you know, and I met with some very senior folks. So a couple of things there. They, I don't know, there's so much ghosts, although some of it may be unresolved feelings about World War II and the Cold War. But Sweden during the Cold War was very heavily armed and actually quietly cooperating with NATO. And they have begun rearming in a serious way. I mean, but they had a first-rate arms industry. They developed a lot of very interesting kit that was really suited to their circumstances. These fighter planes that can take off easily from roads, they put the intakes a little bit higher so that they're less likely to ingest foreign objects as they take off. They have actually quite good armor. They had some very innovative tank designs in the old days. So they're rebuilding. And there are a couple of things that are going on. One is they're serious about it, and they're spending a lot of money. They're giving a lot to Sweden, but it's taking time. And you get a sense of the scale of disarmament. So they want to take their army up to 4 brigades. During the Cold War, they could mobilize 29. They had conscription, they had a well-developed reserve system. Not all those brigades would have been well equipped, but there's a big difference between 4 and 29, and going to 4 is taking years. So it gives you a sense of the challenge. Secondly, apparently, I hadn't fully realized this. The Swedes got a letter from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in December 2021, which I don't think has been released. I've asked about it and I haven't seen it, but he has referenced it, the Swedish foreign minister, in which Lavrov said, okay, you're part of the Russian sphere of influence. You may not join NATO, and your security policy has to be aligned with ours. And this really alarmed them, and to their credit, put their backs up. So there was a lot of motivation to join NATO. Now, as one of the people I was speaking with, who's a very smart guy, said, in 2022, we, the good ship non-alignment, which we had been sailing around the world, suddenly runs into this terrible storm, and we're swamped, and we're about to go under. And then this big ocean cruise liner, the SS NATO, comes by and takes us on board. And it's wonderful. The people are friendly. The bar is great. And then after a couple of years, we learned that there's a new captain, and what he really wants to do is play games of chicken with icebergs, which, is an interesting metaphor. It's, the thing that's painful about it, and that is actually painful to be serious about traveling overseas now, is, people look at you, they feel sorry for you. I'm not used to people feeling sorry for me as an American, because they know what my position is. And it is difficult to explain our country, and it's embarrassing to try. It is really embarrassing. It's mortifying, frankly. I mean, you do it, try to explain what's happening. I used to have an ironclad rule. I'm not going to be overly critical of an American administration while I'm abroad. That rule's gone out the window. But that's challenging. But in any case, the Swedes, the last thing I'll say is the Swedes see this as a 1, possibly 2 generation standoff. So they're thinking longer term. This is not just about Ukraine. This is a broader change in the strategic environment. And, of course, they too have their history with Russia, going back to the Great Northern War, and other things. So they're reaching into their past. Last place was Warsaw.
Before we leave the Nordics, two observations. One, the Russians certainly have the Swedes on their mind. I don't think it was an accident that in Istanbul, Medinsky, the Russian negotiator, told the Ukrainians, he called to mind the Great Northern War against Sweden.
Yeah.
Said, we fought the Swedes for 30 years.
Yeah.
We're ready to fight you for 30 years too. Which is, I think, an interesting choice of. I mean, he didn't choose to, refer to the Great Patriotic War because there were so many Ukrainians who fought and died in it, or he had to go back to back a couple of hundred years. So that's point one. Point two. One thing about the Swedes, they seriously disarmed after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, really seriously. It had been an armed neutrality. I know that my Finnish friends were always very nervous about what the Swedes were doing and kept encouraging them not to completely denude themselves of defenses. But your point, which I think important one to remind us, is that Sweden's neutrality during the Cold War was very much an armed neutrality.
Absolutely.
And they had a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program, up until they abandoned it in the 1970s. So,
So look, that connects to the last place I went to, which is Poland. One of the things that struck me is in Sweden and in Poland, if you have conversations with people and you put the nuclear question on the table, nobody says, "Oh, that's ridiculous. We would never do that." You do not get that reaction at all. I mean, there's a measured discussion of it, and I think it may very well be. It's I am there. It is on the table in a way in Poland. In the first stage, I think they would like to have what's the technical word? They want to have a seat at the nuclear planning table, and I think they would like to have dual key weapons, which actually I think sort of makes sense. But in any case, there's very little question in my mind that the Poles are thinking very hard about this, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Swedes are as well. In Poland, that country is prosperous. They are in the middle of this terrific defense buildup up to 5%, but they are there. There are two things that did strike me about it. One is as they look at us, and particularly when the issue came up of would they be willing to put forces into a reassurance force? The answer is no. They're adamant about that. And if you push a little bit in that, they say, "Look, we followed you to Iraq. We lost people there. So, and you've just told us that you're not willing to put troops on the ground here. So why should we follow your lead?" Now, that wasn't really personally directed at me, but there's a flash of resentment there. The challenge for Poland, which I think they will still struggle with for some time, is because of the heft that they now have economically, and they are, like I said, they're very prosperous. They're a big country, and the size of their military, 5 mechanized divisions, biggest tank fleet in Europe, and those are streaming in. Can they assume a leadership role as well? Again, some of this is very buried very deep in their strategic past, and you can understand it. It's the experience of 1939, and it's the experience of Yalta, and and also there's the same kind of thing that you have with the Estonians, which is this annoyance at the West Europeans. Now, what's interesting is when you had people now are begun to talk about the E4, Germany, France, the UK, and Poland, in terms of dealing with Ukraine, and I think that's promising. But part of what has to change here is the sort of the geometry of power and influence in Europe. Very last thing I'll just say is I think everybody's anticipating that there's going to be some American withdrawal. Everybody understands Americans. It's penetrated that this is not just Trump or J.D. Vance. This is Bob Gates saying you guys need to look after your own defense. What they want and what they are hoping for, whether or not they will get it, is a drawdown that is aligned with their buildup, so that it's not something chaotic, not something that will encourage the Russians to do more things. So I came back in that respect mildly encouraged. The things that I find discouraging, though, are it's going to take them a while to build up. The Russians are being extremely aggressive in the whole gray zone hybrid warfare space. I do think I had a great session with some of the Russia experts in Poland in particular. And, every time I have those kinds of meetings, I just come away thinking the Russians are creating a perpetual warfare state. This, whatever happens in Ukraine, that's not where it ends. No matter what happens, that is not where it ends. And it's a perilous position. And, when you tie that to our beginning comments on the jackasseries of the week, you worry because I'm just I have doubts that our leadership will be able to manage this in any coherent way. I mean, I think Rubio probably has the best instincts of all of them. I mean, I agree that Hegseth is just a knucklehead who's out of his depth, and God only knows where Trump is.
Yeah, I mean, I worry a bit here that our European friends are telling themselves some very self-soothing things about how this is all going to work, and that they continue to invest um, a lot of effort, and I guess there's no alternative, to trying to influence Trump. Um, some of them have been, reasonably, successful, I would say. Keir Starmer, Georgia Maloney, Alexander Stubb,
Alex Stubbs?
Alex Stubb, the Finnish president, maybe more than anybody he has, because he understood kind of instinctively as a former varsity golfer at Furman University, that golf was the way to, get an extended, time to, pitch Trump about your view of the world. And he did that down in Florida pretty effectively, I think. Problem is, it's a little bit like Lucy with the football, right? I mean, I don't know how many times we have to have the president say, "I'm getting fed up with Vlad. Vlad's got, I don't know, he's lost his mind. I don't know what he's doing." And, tweeting that. And, kind of, I then think what happens is, my reading of this is, Lindsey Graham then goes out and tells the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and others, saying, use it as a source close to Trump, that he's getting fed up and he's going to, sanction, Putin. And, and, the, and the Europeans sort of invest all this, hope in this. And then, inevitably he doesn't do it. Now, maybe this time it'll be different, but I don't see any sign of it.
So let me push back a little bit. First, with the European, I mean, I agree with the criticism of the Europeans. They are not moving at the urgency of war in the bill. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on. I mean, you haven't heard, for example, about shortages of 155 millimeter shells. Now, that's partly because they're much less important. I mean, it's staggering now. Most of the losses, like 70% or more, on the front lines are caused by drones, and that's we should have Mick Ryan back on to talk about what's actually happening on the front lines. Um, but they are doing things, and the problem is some of it is not really very public. Part of what they're, by the way, they're going to be doing is funding the Ukrainian defense industry. The Ukrainians don't have a capacity problem, apparently. They have a resources problem. That's just money. So there's that. I think it does make sense to butter up Trump to the extent you can. I don't think you should put all your eggs in that basket, but I don't think they really are. I mean, I think they are doing things, like I said. It's not with the sense of urgency that circumstances require. On Trump himself, and I know that I've, you know, you have criticized me for kind of la-di-da fantasies about the man. There was somebody made a comment which I thought is actually right. So if you look at his comments about Putin, Trump is somebody who can never say, you know what, I think I misjudged the guy. What he has to say is he's changed. It's a different Vlad than the one I knew. And if you'll notice, that is increasingly what he's saying. No, it's I don't think that that's going to turn it into a major confrontation. But here for me is the critical thing. Apparently the flow of weapons and stuff from the previous packages, just fine. Sharing of intelligence continues. I thought it was very interesting that Friedrich Merz announced lifting of all the range limitations, including for the United States. Now, the Biden administration, put on these ridiculous limitations. If they're lifting limitations on use of ranged American weapons, somebody had to give the okay for that.
Well, and beyond ranged American weapons, if it means that the Germans are doing what Merz said he would do before he came into office, which is provide the Ukrainians with Taurus. And I know that he's publicly said he's trying to preserve, as the French have, some strategic ambiguity about what is and isn't being provided. But if they get tourists and they get that's all to the good. And I agree with all of that. I don't disagree with anything you said, honestly. I just, I just, I'm just skeptical that Trump is going to, really put any pressure on Putin to speak of sanctions or perhaps tariffs. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see some secondary tariffs on purchasers of Russian oil. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. But more than that, I'd be shocked, honestly. And I think the real issue is if he gets bored and walks away, which I think is increasingly likely, since I don't think he thinks he can have a big success. And if he's not going to have a big success, I don't think he wants to be involved. The question then becomes, on what terms does he walk away? Does he walk away in a kind of neutral way, which says intelligence sharing will continue? I'm not going to obstruct any direct commercial sales from U.S. defense companies financed by the Europeans for Ukraine, and maybe even certainly allow everything that's in the pipeline from the Biden era to continue. That's one thing. If he walks away and turns it all off, that's a totally different thing.
Right. So, and here's my response to that. I think he probably will want to walk away. Although in a fit of pique, he's capable of doing all kinds of things, or he's also capable of reversing those as soon as he does them. He has done one thing which has damaged the Russians very considerably, much more than Biden has, and that is relaxing all kinds of regulations about oil drilling and fracking. And as well as screwing up the international economic system. When you drive the price of oil down the way he has, that actually is a big hit on Russia. Now, that's not why he did it, of course, but it is a big hit. And I think one needs to recognize that. The other thing I think that we need to bear in mind are actually two things. One is, part of the idiocy of what he's done is to get a lot of Europeans and even the Canadians worried about, well, do we really want to be dependent on the United States for weapons? And so, Rheinmetall is doing just fine. I think it very likely the Europeans will say, okay, we'll buy American weapons and give them to Ukraine. And he will be okay with that, I think, because it's good for the American arms industry and it's good for American jobs. And, so there's that. The other thing, which is really interesting, which I am not capable to judge, or at least I'd want to dig in a lot more deeply. It's clear that in a number of areas, the Europeans have been doing a lot, particularly to try to fill the gaps if there's a shutoff of intelligence. Now, nobody has our overhead constellation, but, I think during the Cold War, there were like 500 satellites orbiting. They're now 12,000, and there are thousands more going up. And some of them are very sophisticated infrared imaging constellations. Of course, you collect intelligence in a variety of ways. So, you can cue one thing off another. So I was somewhat to my surprise, I heard particularly from some people in Poland who were closer to this saying, yeah, it won't be the same thing, but you'd be amazed how much high quality intelligence you can get using commercial technology these days for things like targeting. So now none of this is good news for Ukraine. They still have a big manpower shortage. And, the most serious thing is the Russians are innovating in this top-down way. And like I said, I think we should get Mick Ryan on. But let's not forget that they're also suffering in a variety of ways. I mean, it's now routine that the Ukrainians are shutting down Moscow's airports. And my guess is that's just going to increase. So, we'll see. So, all in all, this was a fascinating trip. It was not entirely reassuring. I didn't expect it to be. And in some ways, it's just, like I said, it is really galling, to go to Europe in particular as an American and have to apologize for the, idiocy, incompetence, venality, corruption, mendacity, and sometimes malignity of your own government. I mean, I have never had to do that before, and I really don't like it, and I don't recommend it.
My wife and I talk all the time after having, lived overseas and represented the United States multiple times, how glad we are that we don't have to do it right now. I mean, I think I think um, it's a real challenge. It's a challenge that led, for instance, Ambassador Bridget Brink to resign and retire,
Yeah.
because I think it became I think the stress of that became in Kiev particularly just too hard to manage. I mean, in general, I mean, we focused a lot on the on the military in our discussions, but I think the State Department, I think, is hemorrhaging, talent
Oh yeah.
at senior levels, and it's talent that can't be easily replaced by intake, because it's experience of 20 years of languages and subject matter expertise, regional areas expertise that you only gain, over time, and you can't take someone who's 26 or 27, even if they've got advanced degrees, and say, oh, well, now you just go in and, fill that void. It just doesn't work that way.
There's down the road, probably not for a couple of years, assuming you and I are still going then, we really will want to talk about how do you reconstruct an effective superpower out of this wanton destruction. And it's there everywhere. I mean, I was thinking of our session with Larry Summers. So they're completely cutting off Harvard from any federal money. And Lord knows I've got my problems with Harvard and the way it's run and the way it's reacted to its various internal crises. But this is madness and this is vandalism of the highest order. And it's, the danger, of course, we're going to get used to this. We say, well, of course, the president's going to take a $400 million gift from Qatar. Why not?
A $400 million gift that is going to cost American taxpayers probably, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. I mean, the irony of, unless the president waives all the requirements,
Which he could,
which would be dangerous, for the national security, but that aircraft is going to have to be ripped down to the studs to make sure that it doesn't have any listening devices implanted in it. It's got to be hardened against electromagnetic pulse. It's got to be given, special communications that can avoid jamming. It's got to be, missile defense capabilities built into it. By the time they get done, Boeing will have delivered the plane that he's pissed off is late and over budget, and the only thing we'll have is a plane with a $2 billion makeover that it becomes his personal plane or the plane of his library or whatever. I mean, it's all madness.
it is all madness. Trying to think if there's any other things from the European trip. Not really, but it is. I mean, what I do come away somewhat more optimistic about is if you look at least the collection of the Nordic states, the Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, and with their challenges, Britain and Holland too, I would say. Those countries understand what the challenge is. Now, they're not always prepared to act on it, or they have trouble getting themselves together. And this is where, as you often point out, leadership is necessary. But they are not there. I did not detect people being inclined to say, "Well, we're going to have to cut some sort of deal with the Russians." That nobody said. No, I wasn't moving in those kinds of circles, to be fair.
Right, but in that sense, the Romanian election is a setback for Putin, and
Absolutely.
that's a good thing. And so, look, I'll take I'll take our victories where I can. That's that's all to the good.
It's the way I think it's the way we have to do it. Um, and then I don't know what else. I guess the big thing that's coming up is this stupid military parade.
Oh God. I will absent myself from the district that day. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, me as well. It's we'll get through this somehow, but boy, it's already been a long I mean, that's that is the amazing thing that I think about. It's only been 4 months.
Yeah, but it's like dog years. I mean, it's like,
Yeah, it is. By the way, I don't think it can continue at this pace, and I don't think it will.
yeah, well, I hope not.
Uh,
But, they seem to keep rolling out, more kind of, there seems like they must have a rule in the White House that there has to be some, legal, constitutional, ethical norm that we have to break each day. But there have to be so many, that are violated each day.
well, and then little quips like the Secretary of Homeland Security not knowing what habeas corpus is. For those who are listening, Eric is sitting there shaking his head in his hands, and
Well, on that note, welcome back stateside. It's good to have you back, and
good to be back.
we'll be doing it again next week.
Yep.